Okay, welcome back. The lecture on cultural materialism was going a little long, so I wanted to split it up a little bit. If the videos are too long, it's really difficult to get them to load up to YouTube and so forth. Okay, so let's jump back in the text where you remember we just finished with that quote, nature is indifferent to where the God is loving Father, bloodthirsty cannibal, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we'll pick it up from there. We're now on page 58. And again, he's offering us or giving us a justification for the importance of the infrastructural component. I'm in the first indented paragraph, about halfway down. He writes, for example, the need to eat is a constant, but the quantities and kinds of foods that can be eaten vary in conformity with technology and habitat. Sex drives are universal, but their reproductive consequences vary in conformity with the technology of contraception, prenatal care, and the treatment of infants. So once again, we see the primacy of production and reproduction. So as he mentions in the next paragraph, unlike ideas, beliefs, dogmas, whatever, patterns of production and reproduction cannot be made to appear and disappear by mere act of will. In other words, they must be tended to. Since they are grounded in nature, they can only be changed by altering the balance between culture and nature, and thus can only be done by the expenditure of energy. On page 62, Harris discusses what he refers to as biopsychological constants. In other words, those aspects that will be found cross-culturally. He's come up with what he calls a minimal set, and you see them there on page 63. First, people need to eat. And then he goes on to describe the diets they will choose. Second, people cannot be totally inactive, but when confronted with a task, they prefer to carry it out while expending less rather than more energy. Number 3, people are highly sexed and generally find reinforcing pleasure from sexual intercourse. Number 4, people need love and affection in order to feel secure and happy. And so you can see how that works into his basic scheme. In the bottom paragraph there, he starts off by saying, despite the parsimony of my list, everyone can immediately think of antithetical behaviors and thoughts, like obesity, the intensive expenditure of energy, abstinence, infanticide, and so forth. But he mentions that nothing that he is stating here suggests that people will that there will be a long-term maximization of anticipated results. In fact, he writes, on the contrary, the selection of maximizing traits recurrently leads to ecological depletions. I'll give you one example. Thus, the pursuit of more proteins frequently ends up with people getting fewer proteins. And often the adoption of labor-saving devices ends up with people working harder. And he writes on page 64 at the top, these paradoxes, bottom of the paragraph, merely expose the puzzles that cultural materialism proposes to solve more effectively than rival strategies. And that's his basic point, is that his explanatory paradigm is more robust. In other words, it will explain more of human behavior than competing paradigms. Okay, on page 66, under the modes of production and reproduction, he writes, cultural materialist principles also depart radically from classical Marxism in regarding the production of children as part of the infrastructure. You'll note that in Marx's famous quote, he doesn't mention reproduction. And Harris is pointing out that that is an important component that does need to be mentioned alongside of production. At the very bottom of that page, that's page 66, he writes, I believe that demographic factors help to explain the historic expansion of productive forces, hence the necessity to rise. In other words, production and reproduction work together. Hence the necessity arises for speaking of a mode of reproduction whose effect upon social structures and ideology is no less important than that of the mode of production. After all, people have to be fed, and lots of people will require lots of food, just to put it very simply. Bottom paragraph on page 67. In other words, cultures have not generally applied the increments in techno-environmental efficiency brought about by the invention and application of labor-saving devices to saving labor, but to increasing the energy, I guess he means output, which in turn has not been used to improve living standards, but to produce additional children. Then he makes some interesting points about demography in early societies. On page 68, this is about halfway down, a little bit more than halfway down the page. It reads, additional means of regulation must be invoked to account for the small size of the human global population prior to 3000 BC in view of the inherent capacity of healthy human populations to double their numbers in less than 25 years. In other words, that wasn't happening. I believe these additional measures involved assault against mother and fetus with the whole body trauma, abortifacients, infanticide, especially female infanticide, and systematic selective nutritional neglect of infants, especially female infants and of pre-adolescent girls. In case you're wondering why he focuses on females, it's because it's control of the number of females in a population that has the greatest bearing on population size, not males. Even males being killed in warfare will hardly affect population growth curve, because it is females that are actually birthing the next generation. So at the top, page 69, in other words, because prehistoric cultures kept their numbers in line with what they could afford by killing or neglecting their own children, they were vulnerable to the lure of innovation that seemed likely to allow more children to live. Thus, Malthus was correct. Malthus put forth the theory that eventually our ability to reproduce is going to overwhelm our ability to feed ourselves. Thus, Malthus was correct in his surmise that population pressure exerted an enormous influence on the structure of pre-state societies. Okay, interesting passage on page 70. This is about 10 lines down. While there are structural and superstructural aspects to the modes of modes of population control, the central issue has always been the challenge the biology of sexual reproduction presents to culturally imposed restraints. In this sphere, as in subsistence production, technological advances are of the greatest import. The only difference being that for production, it is the means of increase that is decisive, while for reproduction, it is a means of decrease that is decisive. People are striving to increase production while decreasing reproduction, is his basic point. Then he goes on to discuss the role of structure and superstructure. He does start off by saying that people criticize cultural materialism because they say it reduces structure and superstructure to mechanical epiphenomena that play only a passive role. But read the first indented paragraph on page 71. As I've said in previous sections, infrastructure, structure, and superstructure constitute a socio-cultural system. In other words, they're interdependent parts. They're all part of a coherent system. A change in any one of the system's components usually leads to a change in the others. That's the basic notion of structural functionalism. In this regard, cultural materialism is compatible with all those varieties of functionalism, employing an organismic analogy to convey an appreciation of the interdependencies among the cells and organs of the social body. But I should note here that you're going to find very few, if any, cultural innovations under structure or superstructure that negatively impact production and reproduction that become widespread in a culture. So yes, celibacy is a thing in some cultures, but no whole cultures practice celibacy. Certain tiny subsets of a culture may. That's just one obvious example of what I'm referring to. In a way, think of the Tsimbaga and their curious homesteading practices. When they came up with the idea that they should homestead high up in the hills, it was actually a reasonable, rational response to the material, natural contingencies of the situation. In other words, it was conducive to biological survival, not detrimental. So it became part of the cultural ethos. Had it been detrimental, then it would not have been accepted as part of the cultural ethos. And then on page 73, to sort of, I guess, echo my comments, look at the second sentence on page 73, second line. Cultural materialism holds that innovations are unlikely to be propagated and amplified if they are functionally incompatible with the existing modes of production and reproduction. Okay, and I'll end this by giving you a couple of examples regarding how cultural materialism has actually been applied quite successfully. If you've taken any of my courses, you've heard me talk about these. There is a beef taboo in India, for example, where cows are considered to be sacred and they're venerated. They're not worshipped, by the way. They're venerated, respected as sacred beings. And this traces back to the early Vedas, the sacred literature of Hinduism. And so therefore, it is taboo to kill and eat cows. So there is a quote-unquote beef taboo. Well, from the Western point of view, if we totally ignore cultural relativism and insist on interpreting things from our point of view, we might say, well, let's just build some slaughterhouses, process this meat, and feed these people. Because after all, There are lots of very, very hungry people in India. It's the second most populous nation on the earth. Well, as anthropologists discovered, and Marvin Harris has commented on, that would be a disaster. Because as it turns out, this old cow, and by the way, we just use cow here in a very generic way to stand for cattle. This old cow that this family owns may be its only lifeline to survival, because they exploit the cow in ways that we would never imagine. They use the dung, for example, as cooking fuel. They use the dung as fertilizer. They use the dung in a paste form to sort of construct or build a floor for people who are living in dirt-floored huts. There's even a little cottage industry where people will collect the dung and sell it. Right? So you can actually talk for about 10 minutes regarding just how they use the dung. So you know at that point that they're very serious about exploiting this cow. And then, of course, they also need the cow to pull a plow in a lot of India, because most families will have a little plot of land where they plant vegetables. Also, too, they get a certain amount of milk from the female cattle. Not a whole lot, but enough to sustain a small family. And then the clincher here is when the cow dies, these people considered to be outcasts. Used to be called untouchables, but that term is like a racial epithet today. But they're literally outcasts. They're outside the caste system. So they have all the quote-unquote crap jobs, right? All the shitty jobs. They work in the sewer. They dispose of corpses and so forth. And when a cow dies, that group will actually dispose of the cow, but they will eat the cow. And of course, them being outside the caste system, they're allowed to do that. So the cows, as it turns out, are actually eaten. So an honest analysis shows us that the Indian could not possibly do anything more to maximize the energy output of their cow. So their behavior is eminently reasonable. So that's how we can understand cows wandering around on the streets, people cursing them and so forth, but yet no one touches them, no one kills them, and Hindus proper don't eat them. Now, interestingly enough, it was no doubt a custom that was very popular thousands of years before any sort of religious ideas were overlain on them. In other words, it was a very sensible cultural practice that later was legitimized with religion and mythology. The pork taboo in the Middle East that today extends to Muslims and Jews is pretty much the same. If you begin with your analysis with religion, you will get nowhere, right? I mean, you find that in ancient holy texts, Leviticus, for example, in the Old Testament, God says the swine is dirty, right? Don't handle pigs; they're unclean. Well, that doesn't make any sense in any way, shape, or form. Right? Because, I mean, obviously there must be a reason why God made that point. Well, as it turns out, if you look only at religion, and of course, the religious folks will tell you, well, because God says not to eat pigs. That's why we don't eat pork. Well, that gets us nowhere. But if you look at the origin of the avoidance of pork, you will find, and you go back to the ancient Middle East, thousands of years before Leviticus was written, you will find that people already recognize the fact that pigs are a very, very, very poor fit for the subsistence mode that they were practicing in the Middle East. Also is a terrible fit for the climate of the Middle East. And so that's where we actually find our answer to why it is that Muslims and Jews don't eat pork. Well, if you want to explore this further, just look at Harris's Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches. But I guess to generalize those two examples, please note that the behavior was around for a long, long time before it was later legitimized or justified by religion and mythology, therefore demonstrating the primacy of infrastructure over superstructure.